Zhang Wei was not one to believe in miracles. Not even after the glowing retinal implants had been approved for human trials. As the lead engineer at Loomtech, a tech company priding itself on groundbreaking medical innovations, Zhang had seen his fair share of game-changing technology. The first generation of retinal implants, which had made blind people see again, was a marvel, of course. But Zhang's project? It wasn't about sight at all. It was about perception. A system that didn't just enhance how you see, but how you experience the world. And Zhang had no illusions. It was going to be a disaster. At least, that's what he had expected when the idea first came to him. What was the point of seeing beyond the human eye's limited spectrum? Who would want to witness the invisible forces that shaped the world? Theoretically, a lot of things could be hidden in the spectrum beyond visible light, radio waves, magnetic fields, even quantum states, things that ordinary people couldn't sense. Zhang didn't care much about any of that, but his funding partners had insisted. Make it happen, Zhang. We're putting you in charge of the future. And so, here he was, staring at the finished prototype of a retinal implant so advanced it could theoretically unlock that extrasensory dimension. Zhang was fidgeting with the little device on the workbench in his cluttered lab, the sterile white room filled with the hum of machinery, a fan blowing air through stacks of papers. A caffeine-addicted genius, he'd hardly slept in the past 3 days. The buzz of excitement in his veins, the dread in his gut, the endless flood of possibilities, all these things swirled in his mind as he stared at the chip-sized piece of technology. It didn't seem much a tiny black disc that would be embedded into the back of the retina, connected to nerves that, in theory, could bypass the brain's limited processing power. Well, he muttered to himself, running a hand through his unkempt hair, time to break something. Again. He didn't bother with the usual precautions. After all, it wasn't like anyone would be around to stop him. He had spent the last month wiring up the entire test facility himself. Zhang had been an outcast in the scientific community, his ideas too radical, his projects too out there for mainstream funding. So, he learned to work alone. Besides, his own vision or lack thereof was what had led him to this point. Who needs perfect vision when I've got algorithms? Zhang chuckled, sitting back on his chair, watching the screens flicker to life. The room's lights buzzed with an almost surreal intensity. Maybe it was just the lack of sleep playing tricks on him. Maybe it was just the thrill of the moment. With a grunt, he slotted the retinal implant into a holder. He prepped the surgical tools with an almost robotic precision. For all his doubts about this project, one thing Zhang had never been was unprepared. He knew that the technology was as dangerous as it was groundbreaking. All right, Wei. No backing out now, he whispered to himself as he injected the anesthetic into his own eye. The very first test subject, the world spun in strange, metallic circles as the anesthesia took effect. Zhang's vision blurred and his body went limp, but he kept his focus. He could still hear the faint buzz of his equipment, the clinking of metal tools. His thoughts started to slip away, fading to a quiet hum as he felt the implant slide in. Zhang woke up to nothing. No pain. No sudden flashes. No bright colors. Just nothing. His eyelids fluttered open, and he stared blankly at the sterile white ceiling. It was a strange feeling, as if time itself had shifted just a little, pulling him into a new moment. But nothing had really changed. Not yet. A faint beep sounded. He reached for his wrist, where a small device had attached itself like a watch. It was his diagnostic readout. His pupils dilated slowly as the data scrolled across the small digital screen in front of him. Everything seemed fine. No immediate issues. No signs of rejection. He was seeing perfectly. His vision hadn't changed one bit. Then, it started. The edges of his vision began to flicker. His surroundings seemed to ripple, warping into a cascade of colors that shouldn't exist. The familiar outlines of the lab, the counters, the cabinets, they all bled and stretched out in ways that defied physics. Zhang blinked, shaking his head, confused. It was like looking through a window at something other. He sat up, rubbing his eyes in disbelief. "Did I accidentally take some LSD?" he mumbled, his voice cracking with nervous laughter. The room didn't look the same. Things had stretched. The metallic walls curved into geometries that weren't supposed to exist. Shapes melted and folded into themselves. The very air seemed to bend in odd directions, refracting light in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Was he dreaming? He took a breath, forcing himself to calm down. No, he was awake. And this wasn't a dream. It was something much worse. Fourth dimension, he muttered to himself, already understanding. Of course. The whole point of the implant had been to allow him to sense things beyond the ordinary. But this? This was insanity. Zhang's hands gripped the edge of the table. His mind was racing logically. He knew he should be terrified, but the overwhelming urge to study, to understand, consumed him. He grabbed the diagnostic tablet from the counter, squinting at it through the distorted world. It felt like reality was breaking down, layer by layer. What was supposed to be just vision now seemed like a doorway to another space, another realm where logic had no place. He could see objects that had no business being visible. Time, too, seemed to move in strange, disconnected intervals. Then something else caught his attention. It wasn't just a distortion of space. It was sound. Waves of static, strange voices, disembodied murmurs. They seemed to swirl just out of reach. The words themselves felt alien. "Am I hearing them?" he asked aloud, though he didn't know who he was speaking to. A voice answered. Or was it a voice? It was like the whisper of 1,000 people at once, each one layered on top of the other. "You see." Zhang froze. His heart skipped a beat. He could hear it now, clearer than ever. The voice wasn't in his head, it was in the air itself. It was almost an instruction. Who are you?" He tried to calm his nerves, but his hands were shaking. He looked around the lab, expecting something or someone to pop into view, but it was empty. The space around him was still shifting, becoming more abstract. "You see," the voice repeated, and this time it felt like a command. Zhang stood up, staggering. The sound was overwhelming. The fourth dimension, he realized, wasn't some theoretical anomaly or a clever trick. It was alive. It was aware of him. But where had it come from? Had the implant connected him to something deeper, a higher state of consciousness? Or was it some hidden facet of reality that he had never before been able to access? He reached for the door, his hand trembling as he tried to focus on the physical world. But it was harder now. The walls were folding in on themselves, spiraling into points of light. He couldn't focus. Reality wasn't cooperating. The more he looked, the more it unraveled. Suddenly, his wristwatch buzzed again, but this time the message wasn't from his diagnostic system. It was a text, one that he knew he hadn't sent. "You're not alone." Zhang recoiled, his breath quickening. His mind screamed. Was this real? Was this happening to him? He couldn't tell anymore. With a sudden snap, the voice returned, booming now, shaking the ground beneath his feet. "You're not meant to see this. Close your eyes. Close your mind." Zhang didn't listen. His pulse quickened as his mind raced to process what was happening. The walls were alive. The very air was alive. And for the first time in his life, Zhang Wei wasn't sure he could trust his own eyes. Zhang stumbled backward, almost falling as his legs failed to support him in this new, fractured world. The walls weren't just warped anymore, they were alive. Each surface vibrated with an eerie hum, pulsating with colors that didn't belong in the visible spectrum. The voice, or rather the voices, had become a cacophony, drowning him in waves of distorted sound. "You're not meant to see this. Close your eyes. Close your mind." The voice reverberated through the room, yet it wasn't coming from anywhere. It was coming from everywhere. It felt like the walls themselves were speaking, the air around him resonating with an intelligence far older than anything Zhang had ever encountered. He could feel the whispers slipping through his thoughts, pulling at the edges of his consciousness. His body trembled, instinctively trying to shut down, but his mind refused to obey. What he was seeing or sensing, or experiencing was too significant to ignore. "No," Zhang muttered through clenched teeth, forcing his mind to stay focused. "I can't. I won't." He gripped the edge of the desk, his nails digging into the cold metal. The pressure on his skull was unbearable, like a million invisible hands squeezing his brain, pulling him deeper into the chaos of shifting space. But somehow, amidst the mental noise, he could still think, still reason that he wasn't imagining this. The fourth dimension, this new world, was real. It wasn't some byproduct of the implant, it was a new layer of reality. One that existed alongside his own, but outside of human perception. And now, he could see it. Or perhaps he was seeing more than just the world. Perhaps he was seeing the fabric of existence itself, stitched together in ways no one was ever meant to understand. "What are you?" Zhang whispered, his voice shaking. For a moment, there was silence. The air grew heavy. And then, almost imperceptibly, the shapes around him began to shift, folding and unfolding in impossible geometries, like origami made from light and shadow. He could feel them, the shapes, the forces reaching toward him, probing his mind, testing him. "You're not ready." The voice was soft, distant. But it was no less terrifying. Zhang's heart raced. "Not ready for what?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The world seemed to stretch out, the walls expanding and contracting like lungs, the floor pulling away into infinity. He staggered backward, falling to the floor, his mind splitting between panic and awe. The voice was everywhere, in the air, in his bones, in his thoughts. "Everything is connected. Everything you see is but a shadow." His head felt like it was going to explode. Every inch of his body screamed to escape, to close his eyes, to turn away from the alien landscape he had plunged into. But he couldn't move. He couldn't tear himself away. Something, some force, was anchoring him to the moment. As much as his rational mind screamed at him to run, to escape back to the safe, predictable world he knew, there was a voice deep within him that refused to obey. He had opened the door. He had seen what lay beyond. There was no turning back. A new sensation swept over him. A vast, unnameable presence seemed to fill the room, like the sudden realization that the air around him wasn't just empty space. It was alive. It had substance. It was aware of him. And it wanted him to understand. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog in his mind. The edges of his vision flickered again, but this time, the distortions weren't just strange colors or shifting shapes. He could see through them, see the underlying structure of everything. The physical world, his laboratory, the chair, the desk, even the air was simply a projection, a thin veil over a deeper, more complex reality. Everything was connected. Threads of light, threads of matter, of information, wove through the space around him. They were too intricate to follow, too vast to comprehend. Yet, somehow, he could feel the patterns. His mind was tuning into them, like an instrument playing a song he had never learned. "You see that it wasn't a voice anymore. It was a pulse, a feeling, a presence." The words felt as if they were woven into the very fabric of the world. He could sense them, not just with his ears, but with every part of him. Every molecule in his body was attuned to the voice now. "Why me?" Zhang gasped, his chest tightening with the effort of holding on to his sanity. "Why am I the one who sees this? What is this place?" For a long moment, there was only the sound of his breathing, heavy and rapid in the vast, empty space around him. The voice didn't respond. But something else did. The walls around him seemed to open up, not in a literal sense, but as if they were folding away into a deeper layer of reality. What had been solid and immovable a moment ago was now an endless horizon of pure potential. Zhang stepped forward, feeling the cold air of the fourth dimension rush past him, but his feet didn't touch the ground. There was no ground. He was floating. But not just in space. He was floating in time, in possibility. The world he knew, the world he had once understood, was a pale, fragile thing compared to the infinite potential that lay here. Why does it look like this? Zhang asked the air, though he knew no one would answer. But the more he asked, the more the landscape began to change. Shapes formed and reformed before him, oscillating between solid and fluid, between the tangible and the intangible. He was standing at the intersection of past, present, and future, but not in a way he could make sense of, because time is not linear. The voice finally answered, but not through sound. It was an impression, a sense of knowing that came from deep within the core of his mind. You see, but you do not understand. You are looking at the world through the lens of limited vision, limited perception. What you call reality is simply one expression of the infinite possibilities that lie beyond. The implications were staggering. The voice had been right. Zhang had opened the door. But now, standing in this new space, he wasn't sure if he wanted to know what lay beyond. Was it enlightenment? Or was it madness, the implant? Zhang whispered, piecing together the fragments of his thoughts. It's changing me. Yes, the voice replied. You are being shown the limits of your understanding, and the boundaries of your existence. Zhang shuddered. The pressure inside his skull was intensifying, his thoughts scattering like marbles in a whirlwind. Every breath felt heavier. Every moment stretched farther than he could comprehend. He felt like he was being pulled deeper into this otherworldly space, drawn toward something he couldn't identify. Something that wasn't human, wasn't even familiar. The space around him seemed to collapse inward, folding into itself like a black hole. But even as he felt himself being pulled in, there was another pull, another force, one that was pushing him back, out of this place. Back to reality. Close your eyes, the voice whispered, but this time, it was not a command. It was a suggestion, a plea. Do not lose yourself. Zhang's body was trembling, his heart pounding in his chest. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, everything stopped, the air, the sounds, the voices, the shifting patterns of light and shadow, they all vanished. The world around him settled into an eerie stillness, but when Zhang opened his eyes again, everything had changed. The lab was gone, replaced by a vast, empty void of swirling darkness and infinite light. And as he stood there, caught between two worlds, he realized that the implant had not just opened a window into the fourth dimension. It had changed him, his body, his thoughts, his very perception of reality. It was all slipping away, piece by piece. The door had been opened, and now, there was no going back. The question wasn't whether he could return to the world he knew. The real question was whether he would even want to, and in that moment, Zhang Wei understood the price of seeing beyond the limits of ordinary vision. It was not just knowledge that he had gained. It was a choice. A choice between who he was and who he was becoming. The question was no longer what the fourth dimension wanted from him. The real question was what he was willing to give up in order to understand it. Zhang stood at the center of the shifting, chaotic void, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of his decision whether to close his eyes or push forward hung heavy in the air. He could still feel the implosion of space around him, the collapsing layers of the fourth dimension pressing in from all sides. It was intoxicating, terrifying, and overwhelming all at once. The world he had once known, the world of concrete walls and predictable laws of physics, felt like a distant memory now. A pale shadow of what he was seeing. What he was becoming. The whispers of the voices filled the air again, only now they didn't sound like a cacophony. They had formed something more distinct, more coherent. It was like an orchestra tuning, every note blending into the next, creating a harmony that both soothed and unsettled. The voice from before was at the center of it all, but now it felt different, as though it were less of an entity and more of a collective presence. You are the bridge. Zhang's breath caught in his throat. The words didn't just reverberate through his ears, they rippled through his entire body. His skin tingled. His mind raced, trying to catch up with what the voice had just said. The bridge. Was he the bridge between the worlds? Between the known and the unknown? Between the tangible and the infinite? Zhang realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that his existence in this space wasn't just as an observer. He was part of it. His mind had already started to align with the strange, quantum forces surrounding him, merging with the fourth dimension in ways that defied logic. But the more he tried to understand it, the more elusive it became. The answers were always just out of reach, like trying to grasp smoke with his bare hands. For a moment, Zhang considered closing his eyes, retreating from the madness. He wanted to, so badly. To fall back into the comfortable rhythms of his old life, to forget this terrifying glimpse into the unknown. But then he remembered the choice, the one that had been placed in front of him the moment he activated the implant. Would he go back? Could he go back? Zhang's hand trembled as it reached for his wrist, where the diagnostic device had once been. It was gone, replaced by an empty, gaping feeling in the pit of his stomach. The data, the numbers, the carefully constructed metrics, they no longer mattered. This place, this fourth dimension, wasn't something he could quantify. He couldn't analyze it with algorithms or equations. It was beyond comprehension, and yet, he was here. He was seeing it. You still don't understand, the voice said, the words unfurling around him like delicate tendrils, soft but insistent. What you see is not all that there is. What you are seeing, Zhang Wei, is a reflection. A projection of the true reality. He flinched. The idea was both profound and horrifying. The world he had known, the life he had built in his laboratory, the work he had so meticulously crafted was a lie. It was all an illusion. A flimsy screen that covered up the raw, untapped potential of the universe. The fourth dimension was not a realm that could be measured, dissected, or truly understood with the tools of human comprehension. It was something deeper, something that existed in a way humans could never grasp without sacrificing their very selves. He was no longer a person in this world. He was a vessel, a conduit for something far greater. And he had crossed a threshold that few ever would, and fewer still could survive. The air around him began to shimmer, to fold in on itself again. A new set of shapes appeared before him, this time more complex, more intricate than anything he had ever seen. They were layers upon layers of what looked like memories. Or perhaps experiences, moments of time that hadn't yet occurred, or might never occur, existing in simultaneous chaos. It was as though the future, past, and present were all converging in one place, all of them interacting with each other in real time. His mind tried to process the images, the swirling patterns, but it was like trying to read a book that had no language. It was overwhelming that he gasped for breath, his chest tightening. The implosion of information around him was too much. The fourth dimension was not a world of rules. It was a world of possibilities, each one as real as the last. And each one connected. His thoughts swirled, becoming more disjointed, more fragmented. He could see the connections between everything now, every molecule, every atom, every interaction between people. He saw how tiny shifts in the flow of time could cause massive changes in the course of events. He had always been fascinated by the concept of chaos theory, the idea that small actions could have far-reaching consequences. But here, in this place, chaos wasn't a theory. It was real. Every breath, every thought, every gesture sent ripples through the very fabric of existence, and in the center of it all was him, Zhang Wei. The voice again, now softer, almost compassionate. You have crossed into a space where time and space have no meaning. But you must choose. Will you stay here, lost in the infinite possibilities of the fourth dimension, or will you return to the world you know? Will you carry the knowledge you've gained, or will you forget it and close your eyes once more? Zhang's heart hammered in his chest. The pull to stay, to immerse himself in the endless patterns, the interconnected web of existence, was strong. But the weight of responsibility pressed down on him too. He had seen enough. He had seen the future and the past, the limitless potential of human possibility, and the fragility of their existence in this vast, uncaring universe. He had crossed a line that few ever would, and yet, even in the face of all this, something inside him resisted. It wasn't fear. It wasn't doubt. It was the need to protect the world he knew, the world that, for all its limitations, was still his. Even if the truths he had uncovered here were beyond his comprehension, he couldn't abandon the world, the people, the life he had built. There had to be a way to keep them safe from this chaos. I can't stay here, he said, his voice hoarse. I won't. I have to go back. I have to make sure no one else ever sees this. Not like I have. Not like this. The voice was silent for a moment, as though considering his words. Then, it spoke, its tone calm, almost resigned. So be it. You will carry the knowledge of the fourth dimension with you. But be warned, it will change you. And when you return, you will never be the same. Zhang felt the pull again, stronger this time, like the very fabric of the universe was reaching out to him, trying to pull him deeper into its folds. But this time, he resisted. He closed his eyes, not to shut out the vision, but to seal it in. To carry it with him, locked away in the deepest recesses of his mind. When he opened his eyes again, the world had returned to normal. The lab. The familiar tools. The sterile white walls. The hum of machinery. He was back. But it was different now. He was different. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. His hands shook, but he steadied himself against the desk, staring at the now quiet screens. The reality he had known was still there, but it felt distant. Faded. As though he were seeing it through a veil, like a painting that had been touched too many times, its lines blurry and indistinct. But there was something else. The voices, the whispers, they were still there, hidden beneath the surface of his mind. He could still hear them, feel them, calling to him, and Zhang Wei knew, deep down, that there would be no escaping the truth he had uncovered. The fourth dimension had changed him. It was a part of him now. And it would always be there, just out of sight, waiting to reveal itself again. For better or worse, he had become something more than human, and in the end, Zhang understood the true cost of knowledge. Once you've seen the truth, you can never unsee it.